The door opened before I even finished knocking, and a small boy in dinosaur pajamas barreled straight into my legs, wrapped both arms around my knee, and shouted up at me with absolute certainty. "Daddy! You're home!" I stood there frozen on a porch I'd never set foot on, in a town I'd never visited, holding a duffel bag that still smelled like the inside of a transport plane, looking down at a child I had never met in my entire life. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do with my hands. Somewhere behind the boy, a woman appeared in the doorway, dish towel still in one hand, and the color drained out of her face so fast I thought she might go down right there on the threshold. "Eli," she said, voice cracking. "Honey, that's not—" But the boy wasn't listening. He just held on tighter, his small fingers digging into the fabric of my pants. His face turned up toward mine with an expression so full of relief and certainty that something in my chest cracked clean down the middle. I didn't know it yet, standing there in my dress uniform with 20 hours of travel still clinging to my skin. But that moment, a stranger's son calling me Dad before I'd said a single word, was about to undo every careful plan I'd made for this visit and rebuild my entire life from the ground up. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 31 years old, and 3 days before that porch, I'd been halfway around the world finishing my 3rd deployment with the Army. The kind of long, grinding tour that changes the shape of a person whether they want it to or not. I'd spent 12 years in uniform by then, long enough that civilian life had started to feel like a costume I used to wear, something I put on for leave and then carefully folded away when it was time to go back. I wasn't supposed to be standing on that particular porch in that particular small town in eastern Tennessee. I was supposed to be driving straight to my own empty apartment outside Fort Campbell, the one with unopened mail stacked by the door and a refrigerator that probably needed throwing out entirely. But 3 weeks before I rotated home, my best friend Tommy Russo didn't make it back from a routine patrol that stopped being routine in about 4 seconds. I was 20 feet away when it happened. I carried part of what was left of him to the medevac myself, and I've spent every night since then replaying those 4 seconds, looking for the version where I move faster, where I see it coming, where Tommy gets to go home and I'm the one who doesn't. Tommy and I had bunked together for 6 years across 3 different postings. He talked about his wife and son constantly, in the specific, endless way men do when they're homesick and trying to convince themselves the life waiting for them is still real. Sarah this, Eli that, a school play Eli was nervous about, a casserole Sarah burned on purpose because she said burnt edges were the best part. I knew the layout of their kitchen before I ever saw it. I knew Eli's favorite dinosaur was a Parasaurolophus, which Tommy always pronounced wrong on purpose because it made Eli laugh every single time he corrected him. I knew Sarah hummed off-key while she cooked, that she kept a junk drawer specifically for Eli's art projects, that she and Tommy had a running joke about a terrible vacation to a beach town where it rained the entire week and they'd ended up playing cards in the motel room instead, which Tommy always said was somehow the best trip they ever took. He showed me pictures more times than I could count, dog-eared photographs he kept in a plastic sleeve in his pack. Eli at every age from newborn to the gap-toothed 5-year-old grinning in the most recent one. I used to tease him that I probably knew more about his son's school schedule than I knew about my own nephews. And Tommy would just laugh and say that was exactly the point. That talking about home was the only thing keeping some of us tethered to who we used to be before deployment started stacking up like years we'd never get back. 2 nights before the patrol, Tommy and I were on watch together, the kind of quiet, bone-tired hour where men say things they'd never say in daylight. He told me if anything ever happened to him, he needed me to check on Sarah and Eli. Not to fix anything, not to replace him, just to make sure they were okay. To look them in the eye once and let them know he'd talked about them every single day. That they were the last thing on his mind before every patrol, every mission, every long stretch of silence. I told him nothing was going to happen to him. I meant it. I was wrong. So 3 days after I touched American soil again, instead of driving to my apartment, I drove 4 hours to a small town I'd never seen, to keep a promise to a man who couldn't ask me to keep it anymore. I'd called ahead, sort of. I'd found Sarah's number in Tommy's old phone, the one the Army had returned to me along with his other personal effects, and I'd sent a short, awkward text the night before explaining who I was and asking if I could stop by briefly to pay my respects. She'd replied with a single line. "Of course. We'd like that." I had no idea what I was walking into. I definitely didn't expect a child to launch himself at my legs and call me Dad before I'd even managed to say hello. Sarah pulled Eli back gently, crouching down to his level, her voice gentle but strained in a way that told me this had happened before. Eli, baby, this is Mr. Hale. He's not Daddy. Remember what we talked about? Eli looked at her, then back up at me, his small face crumpling with confusion rather than embarrassment. But he looks like the picture, he said. The one by my bed. Sarah's eyes closed for half a second, like she was bracing herself against something. When she opened them again, she looked at me with an apology written so deep into her expression that I felt it land somewhere just beneath my ribs. "I'm so sorry," she said. "He's been doing this. Any man in uniform, any man with dark hair who walks up our porch steps, he runs at them. The therapist says it's normal for his age, that grief doesn't always look the way we expect from a 5-year-old. He just wants Daddy to come home so badly that some part of him keeps deciding it's finally happened." I crouched down slowly, putting myself at Eli's height, trying to remember everything Tommy had ever told me about how to talk to him. "Hey, buddy," I said. "I'm Marcus. Your dad and I were friends. Really good friends. He talked about you every single day." Eli studied me with the unfiltered seriousness only small children manage. "Every day?" "Every day," I said. "He told me your favorite dinosaur is a Parasaurolophus, and that you can say it better than he can." A small, surprised smile broke through. "Parasaurolophus," he said perfectly proudly. "Daddy always said it wrong on purpose." He told me that, too. Sarah made a sound that was half laugh, half something closer to breaking, and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "Would you like to come in?" she said, not quite a question, more like something she needed to do before she lost the nerve. The house was small, warm, lived in a way that made my chest ache. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator, a man's jacket still hanging by the door that I knew without asking was Tommy's, because I'd seen him wear it in photos 100 times. There was a particular quiet hanging over everything, the kind that settles into a house after loss and doesn't fully leave no matter how many lights you turn on. I sat at their kitchen table and told Sarah everything I could bear to tell her, the parts that were true and kind and worth keeping, leaving out the 4 seconds I replayed every night. I told her how Tommy used to talk about her cooking, how he'd kept a photo of the two of them taped inside his helmet liner, how he once spent an entire week's pay at a market overseas trying to find a gift that reminded him of her, even though there was nowhere to send it. Sarah cried quietly through most of it, not the dramatic kind of crying, just steady tears she didn't bother wiping away, like she'd long since stopped being embarrassed by grief in her own kitchen. Eli sat in his booster seat the whole time, eating crackers, watching me with an intensity that made me feel like he was studying for a test only he understood. When I finally stood to leave, promising to keep in touch, he slid out of his chair and grabbed my hand before I could reach the door. "Are you coming back?" he asked, very, very seriously. I looked at Sarah, unsure what the right answer was. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "I'll come back," I told myself, driving away from that house with the sun setting behind me. That I'd visit once more, maybe twice, fulfill the promise properly, and then let them go on with their lives without the complication of a stranger who reminded a confused little boy of the father he'd lost. That was the plan. It lasted exactly 9 days. Sarah called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight in a way I recognized immediately as someone trying very hard to sound like she wasn't asking for help. The transmission in her car had died completely. The mechanic wanted $1,100 she didn't have, and she had no way to get Eli to school or herself to her shift at the hospital where she worked as a billing coordinator. She wasn't calling to ask me for anything. She made that clear 3 separate times in the same phone call. She was calling, she said, because Tommy's old service buddy had said to keep in touch, and she didn't really have anyone else's number who'd understand why she was upset about something as ordinary as a broken transmission. I drove the 4 hours back that same night. No real plan beyond getting there. The highway dark and empty in the way only late-night drives through rural Tennessee can be. I want to be honest about something. I didn't drive back purely out of obligation to a promise. Somewhere in those 9 days, I'd kept thinking about that kitchen table, about Eli's small hand wrapped around mine at the door, about the particular kind of loneliness that lives in a house where grief has nowhere left to go, because the person everyone needs to talk to about it is the one who's gone. I'd spent 12 years learning how to be useful in situations most people run from. This felt like exactly that kind of situation, except the stakes weren't a mission. They were a 5-year-old boy and his exhausted mother trying to hold a life together with both hands. I fixed what I could fix that week. Not the transmission. That needed an actual mechanic. But I covered the repair without making a production of it, framing it as something Tommy would have wanted, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. I drove Eli to school 3 mornings that week while Sarah's car sat in the shop. I sat through one entire dinosaur movie I'd already seen twice because Eli insisted I hadn't really watched it the first time since I kept talking instead of watching. The town noticed fast, the way small towns always do. I caught the looks at the grocery store, at the gas station, the particular kind of attention reserved for a strange man spending time at a recent widow's house. Sarah's sister, a sharp-tongued woman named Renee, who clearly loved her fiercely and trusted almost no one on her behalf, showed up unannounced one evening while I was helping Eli with a puzzle on the living room floor. "Can I talk to you outside?" Renee said, in a tone that wasn't really a question. We stood on the porch while Sarah put Eli to bed. Renee crossed her arms and looked at me like she was deciding whether I was a threat worth taking seriously. "I don't know you," she said. "I don't know what you want here. My sister buried her husband 6 weeks ago. She is not in any state to be figuring out what kind of man you are, and I'm not going to stand by while my nephew gets attached to someone who might disappear the second this stops being convenient." "That's fair," I said, because it was. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I made a promise to Tommy. I'm trying to keep it. And when does the promise end? When does checking in turn into something you're not prepared to actually be?" I didn't have a clean answer for that, because the honest one was that I didn't know yet, and admitting that felt riskier than lying. So I told her the truth instead, which was harder. "I don't know," I said. "I came here planning to visit twice and go back to my life. That's not what's happening. I don't have a plan for what this becomes. I just know I'm not going to disappear on a kid who already lost one father." Renee studied me for a long moment, the porch light catching the same tired worry I'd seen in Sarah's eyes. "Don't make me regret not running you off tonight," she finally said, and walked back inside without waiting for a response. I sat alone on that porch for a while after she left, turning her words over. She wasn't wrong to be suspicious. I'd shown up in their lives carrying a promise and a duffel bag, and I had no real proof to offer that I wasn't going to vanish the moment things got complicated, the way the easiest people always seem to when grief turns out to be a long, unglamorous process instead of a single hard week. All I had was the intention to stay, and intentions are cheap until you've spent months proving them. Over the following months, what started as obligation slowly reshaped itself into something neither Sarah nor I had a name for yet. I took leave whenever I could and drove the 4 hours without needing to be asked. I learned the rhythm of their house, which floorboard creaked outside Eli's room, how Sarah took her coffee, the exact volume Eli's nightmares reached before someone needed to go sit with him until he settled. Sarah, for her part, stopped apologizing every time she needed help with something, which I understood was its own kind of trust being rebuilt one small request at a time. We didn't talk about what we were becoming. There was an unspoken agreement to let it happen slowly, carefully, without naming it too soon and scaring it away. Some evenings after Eli was finally asleep, Sarah and I sat on the back porch steps and talked about Tommy, the real him, not the careful, polished version people offer at funerals. She told me about the fights they'd had over stupid things, the year he forgot their anniversary because of a field exercise, the way he used to sing terribly on purpose just to make Eli laugh. I told her things Tommy had told me in the dark on watch, things he probably never said to her directly, because some thoughts only come out at 2 in the morning in a place far from home. Somewhere in those conversations, grief stopped being the only thing connecting us. Eli stopped calling me Daddy after the first month, which surprised me because I'd assumed the confusion would linger longer. Sarah explained gently to him over and over, with more patience than I think I could have managed, that Daddy was gone and wasn't coming back, but that Marcus was someone who loved him and wasn't going anywhere either. Eventually, Eli landed on a name of his own choosing one morning at breakfast. "Without any prompting from either of us, you can be my Uncle Marcus," he announced, like he was bestowing a great honor, "since you're not my dad, but you're still my person." Something about "you're still my person" nearly took my legs out from under me right there in the kitchen. The complications weren't always gentle. There was a night, maybe 4 months in, when Sarah broke down completely after Eli asked her, with the casual brutality only children manage, whether I was going to be his new dad someday. She found me in the kitchen afterward, eyes red, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding her own ribs together. "I don't know what we're doing," she said. "I don't know if this is healing or if I'm just using you to fill a hole that isn't supposed to be filled by anyone but Tommy. I don't know if it's fair to you, watching me grieve a man you served with, knowing things about him I'll never get to know, carrying guilt I can see in your face every single time his name comes up. I didn't deny the guilt. I couldn't. I think about those 4 seconds every night, I told her, the first time I'd said it out loud to anyone. I think about what I could have done differently. I'll probably think about it for the rest of my life. But that's mine to carry, Sarah. It's not something you owe me comfort for, and it's not a reason for either of us to stay distant from something that might actually be good. Is this good? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Or is this just two broken people finding the nearest warm thing to hold on to? Maybe it started that way, I said. I'm not going to pretend it didn't, but I don't think it's that anymore. I think about you when I'm not here. Not just Eli, not just the promise, you. The way you laugh at your own jokes before you finish telling them. The way you've kept this house feeling like a home, even while you're falling apart inside it. I didn't expect that. I didn't come here for that. But it happened. And I'm done pretending it hasn't. Sarah didn't say anything for a long moment. Just stood there with her arms still wrapped around herself, studying my face like she was trying to find the lie in it and couldn't. I'm scared, she finally said, of wanting this. Of what it means if I let myself want it. I'm scared too, I admitted. I've spent 12 years being good at exactly one thing, and it's not this. I don't know how to do slow and careful and domestic. I know how to carry heavy things and keep moving forward. Maybe that's not so different from what you need right now. She let out a sound that was almost a laugh, watery and surprised. That's either the worst or the best thing anyone's ever said to me. I'm hoping for best. She crossed the kitchen then, slowly, like she was giving herself every chance to change her mind and not taking it, and rested her forehead against my chest the way I imagined she used to with Tommy, except this time it was me standing there, steady, letting her hold on to whatever she needed to hold on to. I don't want you to be a replacement, she said quietly. I want you to be your own thing, whatever that ends up being. I'm not trying to be him, I said. I never could be, even if I wanted to. I'm just trying to be someone worth staying for. Word got back to me eventually, through one of Tommy's other old friends from the unit, that some people in the small circle who'd known us overseas thought it was too soon, thought I was overstepping a line that should have stayed uncrossed for at least a year, maybe longer. I understood the instinct. I'd have thought the same thing about someone else in my position. But grief doesn't move on anyone else's calendar, and neither does the slow, complicated work of two people deciding whether to build something out of what's left after losing someone they both loved in very different ways. Renee came around eventually, too, though it took longer than I expected and more patience than I knew I had. She showed up one Saturday while I was teaching Eli how to throw a baseball in the backyard. Badly, since I'm better with a rifle than a glove, and she watched from the porch for a long while before walking over. He's different since you started coming around, she said, watching Eli chase a ball he'd thrown almost straight up in the air. He sleeps better. He doesn't ask for his dad as much, which I know sounds awful, but it's not that he forgot. It's that he's not as scared anymore that nobody's coming back. I'm not trying to make him forget Tommy, I said. I know that now, she said. I see it. You talk about him like he's still allowed to take up space here. Most people who come into a situation like this try to make the dead disappear so they can have all the room to themselves. You don't do that. He doesn't disappear, I said. He's why I'm here in the first place. Renee nodded slowly, looking out at her nephew laughing in the grass. And for the first time since that tense conversation on the porch months earlier, something in her expression eased into something close to trust. A year after that first afternoon on the porch, I requested a duty station transfer close enough to drive home most weekends, the kind of paperwork that takes months and favors, and a conversation with a commanding officer who'd known Tommy and understood exactly why I was asking. It came through in the spring. I moved into a small rental 15 minutes from Sarah's house, close enough to be present without rushing anything neither of us was ready to rush. Eli turned 6 that summer. At his birthday party, surrounded by other kids from his class and a backyard full of balloons Sarah had spent 2 days inflating, he climbed up onto my lap during a quiet moment between games and rested his head against my shoulder, sticky with cake frosting and entirely unbothered by it. Uncle Marcus, he said. Yeah. Buddy? I still have the picture of Daddy by my bed. But I moved it so there's room for one of you, too. I didn't trust my voice for a moment. Across the yard, Sarah was watching us, a paper plate forgotten in her hand, her eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with something gentler, finally taking root where grief used to live alone. I'd like that, I finally managed. I'd like that a lot. That evening, after the guests had gone and Eli had fallen asleep mid-sentence on the living room floor surrounded by wrapping paper, Sarah and I sat on the back porch steps the way we had so many evenings before. Except this time, the silence between us didn't carry the same weight of unfinished grief. It carried something steadier. "Tommy would have liked you," she said, looking out at the yard. "I used to wonder if that was a strange thing to think, but I don't think it is anymore. I think he'd be glad it was you who kept the promise. I think he'd be glad it became more than the promise. I think about him every day," I said. "I don't think that ever stops. But it doesn't feel like it's pulling me away from this anymore. It feels like it's part of how I got here." Sarah reached over and laced her fingers through mine. The same porch where a small boy in dinosaur pajamas had once mistaken me for his father before I'd even said hello. The same porch where Renee had warned me not to disappear. The same porch where promises kept growing into something none of us had planned for and all of us, eventually, were grateful for. "He's not going to remember a version of this family that doesn't include you," Sarah said quietly. "Is that strange to admit?" "No," I said. "I think that might be the whole point." We sat there a long while, the porch light buzzing softly above us. The house behind us finally quiet in the particular way of a home settling into peace instead of absence. I thought about those 4 seconds I still replayed some nights, the ones I probably always would. I thought about a promise made in the dark to a man who never got the chance to see how far it would carry the people he loved most. I thought about a small boy who'd looked up at a stranger on a porch and called him Dad before either of us knew what that word was going to mean. I'd spent 12 years learning how to walk into uncertain places and find a way to be useful, steady, necessary. I never expected the place that needed me most would be a small kitchen table in eastern Tennessee, a boy who loved dinosaurs, and a woman learning how to let someone new stand beside her without erasing the one who came before. But that's where I ended up, and some nights, sitting on that porch with Sarah's hand in mine and Eli's laughter still echoing faintly from somewhere inside the house, I think Tommy knew exactly what he was asking of me that night on watch. Not just to check on them, to stay if staying turned out to be what they needed. And it did. It still does. Every single day I get to walk back through that door and hear someone call out, certain and unafraid, that I'm finally